I couldn't think of a better fit for what we're trying to consider today in this room than Roy Scranton. He's the author of Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization, and his most recent novel came out just this past year called War Porn. About learning to die, Naomi Klein said that Roy Scranton lucidly articulates the depth of the climate crisis with an honesty that is all too rare, then calls for a reimagined humanism that will help us meet our stormy future with as much decency as we can muster. So Roy has written on climate change, war, literature for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Nation, Dissent, Boston Review, and other publications. He holds an MA from the New School for Social Research and a PhD in English from Princeton. He comes to us today where he teaches in the Department of English at the University of Notre Dame. So Roy, thank you so much for joining us. Yes, are you ready to go? Okay, you look surprised, but who are they talking about? That's you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline, for that introduction. Thank you, Rory, for the invitation, and thank you, Howard, and the organizers and everyone. I'll just do this here. I come from working class. Just a personal note. I come from working class background, and I have the PhD from Princeton, but I have a very non-traditional educational background, and were it not for public libraries and librarians, I wouldn't have survived to adulthood, and much less survive my 20s. And so it's an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk about archive and the Anthropocene. Thank you for inviting me. As you may know, or as Madeline suggested, in Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, I make an argument that really adequately confronting and making sense of climate change and our relation to a climate change world demands recognizing and even accepting that we've failed to stop catastrophic climate change, and there's not likely going to be any change on that front. The failure is probably just going to magnify and ramify, and that step, that learning to die idea, is the first thing that we need to do in order to try to imagine something different. Imagine something different in the present, and imagine something different in the future. What happens, to try to imagine a possible future. And that's, so rather than simply reprise some of the arguments from Learning to Die or something like that, I wanted to push my thought in some of those directions today. So that's what I'm gonna present to you, and it is a bit of a work in process. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation we might have. Looking forward to the conversation in general today, and with that, I'll just begin. The sole remaining utopian thought available to anyone paying attention to our ongoing global climate catastrophe, not founded on a belief in miracles, forms of political naivete scarcely credible in educated adults, or sheer denial masquerading as positive thinking, presents a vision of the future shockingly different from the more archetypical one of the final, fully enlightened fulfillment of the perfected technological society, for which fact we might at this late date be cynically relieved, were it not the case that the bright, shining vision of the best possible future our last utopia offers is nothing more than the bare survival of the human species. This in itself may seem a grim prospect, given how little Homo sapiens has done for its planet to earn a reprieve from extinction, and how little we seem to be able to learn from our history. Yet it remains, for all that, the cheeriest possible future for those of us committed to imagining any realistic vision of the future at all. It is a cold-hearted misanthrope who can take pleasure in the idea of a world without us, without themselves, without friends, family, children, music, art, literature, the Parthenon and the Taj Mahal and the temples of Myanmar, a world without memory, history, consciousness as we understand it, or any trace of human accomplishment beyond the geological scars of our collective monstrosity and the biological wastelands left behind after anthropogenic runaway greenhouse feedback. Not only are we seemingly programmed to believe in the future, but, as philosopher Samuel Scheffler argues, faith in some kind of continued human existence beyond our own death, whether that takes the form of heaven, reincarnation, or simply the next generation, is a necessary condition for living a meaningful life. As he writes in Death and the Afterlife, our confidence in our values depends both on death, which is inevitable and which many of us nevertheless fear, and on the survival of human life, which is not at all inevitable, and threat to which most of us do not fear enough. Global climate change poses such a threat, and in doing so provokes questions that cut through policy and politics into the very marrow of our manifest and latent values, to the very heart of what it is we think we're doing and why we think it's important. Because one very real possible result of runaway greenhouse warming is the extinction of human consciousness on Earth for all time. Among the most serious questions climate change poses are what kind of future we, meaning human beings, might have, and what we, meaning scholars, writers, thinkers, humanists, librarians, might have to offer humans of the late Anthropocene, which is a corollary of the more general question, what do we do? To which the only prudent answer seems to be to try to save something of the past for the future while adapting as best we can to the catastrophic present. Thus, any answer to the insistent question of what to do and the corollary question of the lasting value of whatever that may be must begin from a utopian premise, the sole remaining utopian thought available. As a scholar, writer, thinker, teacher, objectively committed to an idea of human culture extending beyond the here and now and across borders through other languages, deep into the past and at least some distance into the future, I can only make sense of the work that we do in the flickering light of the hope that there will be humans after the flood. We should admit that this is a strange position from which to think the notion of utopia. I take the term up here in a more or less vulgar sense, though a vulgar sense informed by an awareness of utopia's formal role in modern progressivist teleologies as the other of the present, at once critique and program. Frederick Jameson writes in Archaeologies of the Future, quote, "The fundamental dynamic of any utopian politics or of any political utopianism will always lie in the dialectic of identity and difference. To the degree to which such a politics aims at imagining and sometimes even realizing a system radically different from this one." If we take Jameson's claim seriously, then the dialectic that emerges from within his analysis when applied to our current situation is a dialectic of survival and extinction, or more accurately, extinction and survival, for the latter term is the utopian other of our contemporary civilizational and biological suicide. So maybe you're thinking, now there he goes being all apocalyptic. It's really not all that bad. Maybe you think of solar power or the Paris Agreement or carbon capture and sequestration or whatever magic trick onto which your faith in technological progress has cathected in your mind's effort to hold back its anxiety at a rising awareness of our planet's turbulent and unstoppable transition to a new climate and the manifest failure of the best and brightest to slow down, plan for, or even acknowledge that process. That's fine. I will pray with you to God or nature or Lady Luck that you're right about the renewables and the carbon scrubbers, or that China will take over and force everyone to go solar, or that suddenly we'll engage in a furious spate of building nuclear power plants, or that somehow all the scientific predictions and models which tell us that business as usual is going to get very bad very soon are all wrong. But in the meantime, before our miraculous salvation appears as a great golden light in the sky, I would suggest that it might be prudent to act on the evidence, which is, as Andreas Malm argues in Fossil Capital, which is his beautifully written account of why early British industry chose coal over water, even as a power source, despite the fact that water was much, much cheaper. And as Timothy Mitchell argues in Carbon Democracy, and as basically the entire course of human history shows, that the powers that be who control the power will, when forced, choose to maintain their control over the power, over all questions of efficiency, cost, or justice, which means we're in a Titanic kind of situation where the rich would rather watch the ship sink from their lifeboats than save it if salvation means actual democratic governance. Which is all sort of to say, if you don't already believe we're totally screwed, then I'm not going to convince you today. I could do the whole numbers thing, show you the hockey stick graphs, talk about melting Arctic and Antarctic ice and greenhouse feedback and tipping points, rehearse the history of political failure and obstruction since 1988, scare you with stories of methane and sea level rise and drought and famine and war. But either you already know all that or you don't care. Whether you agree with me or not, though, I'd ask you to grant me the point for the sake of discussion, since the question at stake here is what the work of scholars, writers, thinkers, intellectual scientists, and humanists would mean to a future human community after the collapse of civilization as we know it. What might the state of the humanities in the late Anthropocene look like? How might we argue for a future-oriented survivalist ethos of preservation? How might that ethos affect the goals and direction of our work? How might that ethos harmonize or conflict with other ethical positions on offer in contemporary capitalism? For example, liberal multicultural progressivism, techno-futurist liberation, Marxist revolution, market totalitarianism, accelerationism, anarcho-Christian tribulational millennialism, or more and more popular these days, good old nihilism. What are the risks in taking on a survivalist ethos? What are the opportunities? What are the obligations? All these questions are too big to solve or even properly address alone in one talk, all at once. But given that the figure of history seems to have put her thumb on the fast forward button with last year's election, it seems important to begin formulating answers, both in theory and in practice. The data refuge and data rescue projects from the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, for instance, which has worked to protect government climate research from erasure by the Trump administration by backing it up outside U.S. borders, is a striking example of preservation as resistance, although it remains a solution within certain limits since it relies on the persistence of digital storage and retrieval technology, which itself depends on a free and viable global internet, and doesn't address questions of how to organize, transmit, or read code that information into useful, legible content. It's a start, but we need to think outside the cloud, as it were. I would suggest, with my training as a literature scholar, that we can start perhaps by looking at some of the different ways that imaginative writers have conceptualized the persistence of literate human culture in a post-apocalyptic utopian future, asking what they might suggest to us for thinking about our work today and what they might be able to teach us about our own ambiguous role as tomorrow's archive. Because the first thing we need to realize, after all, is that we're not just preserving data for the future, we are the data for the future. We're the future's historical data. So how might we imagine ourselves as the future's ancient dead? Two of the examples I want to look at are relatively recent, written in response to climate change. Two of the other examples are slightly older, thinking through a prior moment in the extinction survival dialectic, that arising out of the threat of nuclear war. And the fifth and final example splits the difference, talking about runaway greenhouse warming within a Cold War imaginary. My first examples are similar enough to initially treat together The Collapse of Western Civilization by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, and William Gibson's science fiction novel, The Peripheral. In both cases, what we're dealing with is basically the continuation of Western technological civilization in a post-catastrophe future, characterized by, one, the center of global power having shifted away from the United States toward China in one case and toward Russia in the other. Two, global climate change causing a period of massive humanitarian disaster called The Great Collapse by Oreskes and Conway, and The Jackpot in Gibson's novel. And three, this period of destruction ending with the invention of carbon scrubbers, carbon capture and sequestration, and the resumption in modified form of civilization as we know it. Oreskes and Conway describe the Great Collapse in their book as follows. Analysts had predicted that an 8-meter sea level rise would dislocate 10% of the global population. Alas, their estimates proved low. The reality was closer to 20%. Although records for this period are incomplete, it is likely that during the mass migration, 1.5 billion people were displaced around the globe, either directly from the impacts of sea level rise or indirectly from other impacts of climate change, including the secondary dislocation of inland peoples whose towns and villages were overrun by eustatic refugees. Dislocation contributed to a second Black Death as a new strain of the bacterium Yersinia pestis emerged in Europe and spread to Asia and North America. In the Middle Ages, the Black Death killed as much as half the population in some parts of Europe. This second Black Death had similar effects. Disease also spread among stressed non-human populations. Although accurate statistics are scant because 20th century scientists did not have an inventory of total global species, it is not unrealistic to estimate that 60 to 70% of species were driven to extinction. There is no need to rehearse the details of the human tragedy that occurred. Every schoolchild knows of the terrible suffering. Suffice it to say that total losses, social, cultural, economic, and demographic, were greater than any in recorded human history. Survivors' accounts make clear that many thought the end of the human race was near. Indeed, had the Sagan effect, that is, uncontrollable greenhouse feedback, continued, warming would not have stopped at 11 degrees, and a runaway greenhouse effect would have followed. Oreskes and Conway's narrative is a history lecture from a Chinese academic in the year 2393. Their scholar discreetly doesn't go into detail on how many humans precisely died during the Great Collapse, although he suggests that it was in the billions. He implies that the second Black Death killed half the population in Europe, Asia, and North America, and mentions cavalierly that the entire population of both Africa and Australia were wiped out. In the future of Gibson's novel, The Peripheral, we know that 80% of the human race is killed. One character explains the jackpot like so. It was multi-causal, with no particular beginning and no end, more a climate than an event, so not the way apocalypse stories like to have a big event after which everybody ran around with guns, or else were eaten alive by something caused by the big event. Not like that. No comets crashing, nothing you could really call a nuclear war, just everything else tangled in the changing climate. Droughts, water shortages, crop failures, honeybees gone like they almost were now, collapse of other keystone species, every last alpha predator gone, antibiotics doing even less than they already did, diseases that were never quite the one big pandemic, but big enough to be historic events in themselves, and all of it around people, how people were, how many of them there were, how they'd changed things just by being there. But science, he said, had been the wild card, the twist. With everything stumbling deeper into a ditch of shit, history itself become a slaughterhouse, science had started popping. So everything, however deeply fucked in general, was lit increasingly by the new, by things that made people blink and sit up. But then the rest of it would just go on, deeper into the ditch. A progress accompanied by constant violence, he said, by sufferings unimaginable. None of that, he said, had necessarily been as bad for very rich people. The richest had gotten richer, there being fewer to own whatever there was. Constant crises had provided constant opportunity. At the deepest point of everything going to shit, population radically reduced, the survivors saw less carbon being dumped into the system, with what was still being produced eaten by those towers they'd built. And seeing that, for them, the survivors, was like seeing the bullet dodged. Where Oreskes and Conway build their post-apocalyptic utopia on Japanese carbon-eating lichen and autocratic Chinese communism, Gibson's world looks more like a vast and lonely shopping mall with giant carbon-scrubbing towers, great virtual reality, nanotech, performance art, and rewilded, mostly empty cities, all ruled by shadowy Russian kleptocrats. It's hard to imagine, right? In both visions, advanced human civilization as we know it continues, and in both situations, a tiny minority of the species survives to enjoy both the refreshed bounty of what Marx called the free gift of nature to capital and new technological developments, which in the China of 2393 presumably include at least more advanced biotech, and in Gibson's post-jackpot world include remote-controlled androids, wondrous 3D printing capabilities, nanotech, and quantum computing. In both visions, the survivors are predominantly from the global north. And the troubling question of human overpopulation, an elephant always in the room when we talk about global climate catastrophe, is dispensed with by the convenient fait accompli of deliberately unspecified amorphous extermination. Orestes and Conway's Chinese historian notes only that the entire population of Africa was wiped out. The questions of how that happened are left unaddressed. Likewise with Gibson, the jackpot is a dark time, the details of which are too gruesome to go into, but it is the rich who survive. We might, perhaps contentiously, take these utopias as fantasies of white nationalist survivalism on a global scale, something like a reductio ad absurdum of Ben Lerner's curious novel 1004, which presents climate change as an existential problem for racialized white reproductive futurity, ostensibly solvable by the gentrification of Brooklyn. Thus the flood comes and takes all the brown people with it, leaving mainly whites and Asians to write history and surf the internet. It's in surfing the internet, of course, that these two visions diverge the most. The key element, conceit of Gibson's novel isn't that it's set partly in a post-climate change world, but that the internet somehow mysteriously allows that future to connect with its past. In fact, there's a whole group of people devoted to connecting with and playing in the past through the internet, known as continua enthusiasts. I say the past, but I should really say pasts, hence continua, because Gibson's rather traditional solution to the paradox of changing one's own past is that each intervention into these continua, each intervention into the past creates a new historical continuum, a new temporal line, a new future distinct from the one in which Gibson's characters live, and perhaps even some futures without jackpots. We might take this as an allegory of history and even politics in the contemporary moment, in which the stakes of intervening in history, or even history with a capital H, seem personally no greater for those making the intervention than the stakes of winning a round of Halo or World of Warcraft are for the alienated gamers living out their fantasies of agency online. The powerful are separated from the consequences of their actions by a great wall of money, in much the same way as the peripheral's future is separated from its past. Yet in both worlds, the 1% are as gods playing with their toys, who happen to be us. We could also read the peripheral's clever and complex time machine as a meditation on the problem of how to get politics back from the virtual into the actual. The problem of moving from the continua of the past into the future is mediated in Gibson's novel via peripherals, these soulless androids that you can control from a distance, which the past or online or virtual humans can bring to life through the internet. Perhaps, this is an allegory for Donald Trump in some way. We might ask, thinking about it in this respect, whether Trump learned to intervene in history through Twitter, or whether Twitter learned to intervene in history through the empty visage of the Donald. In either case, the question for us today is what these utopias mean for the future of our work. They're both quite hopeful, since obviously science and history and art and literature all go on in these post-jackpot worlds. Imagining these futures is not all that different, actually, from being in the position Walter Benjamin found himself in when trying to imagine a post-fascist future. History will be written and rewritten again by the winners, and as that history, it seems to me from this perspective, our ethical obligation today would be something in a Benjaminian line. To continue to write history against the grain, to continue trying to recover that which has already been lost, to continue trying to keep some jagged splinter of the past alive in the hope that it might be that dialectical image, perhaps useful in a moment of crisis, but more importantly, in the hope that it might keep certain aspects of the past alive at all. From this perspective, our obligations might be to preserve, to record, to fight forgetting and erasure, and to resist the inevitable rewriting to come. The practical questions are what this would mean for our work, what subjects we choose, what problems to explore, how to construct our narratives, how to protect them. But of course, we all also know that Benjamin killed himself, and that his last works, especially the theses on the philosophy of history, are more elegiac than pragmatic. The status of our hope in this vision of the future, even as recognizably modern future, remains more or less ambiguous. My next two case studies are post-apocalyptic novels set after a nuclear war. A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. and Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban. Though similar in that both begin in a world full of dangerous mutants, wild animals, and nomadic raiders, in which human civilization has regressed to a state resembling Europe in the early Middle Ages, and knowledge of the past is only available in misunderstood fragments, the two novels differ in how those fragments of the past survive and live in the future. Walter Miller's book follows the survival of pre-deluge artifacts called the memorabilia, as they are preserved and passed down by Catholic monks of the Albertian Order of Leibowitz, residing in a monastery in the American Southwest, hundreds of years in the future. What sustains and preserves the culture of the past in Miller's utopia are these small, dedicated groups of ascetics. First, smugglers, called bookleggers, protecting books from mobs of anti-intellectual book-burning mutants. Librarians, translators, and copyists, organized into religious orders and committed to preserving human knowledge as a form of devotion to the divinity present in humankind. So it's not a secular kind of preservation. It's not humanist. It's very definitely Catholic and Christian. It's vision of Christ that, in Gerard Manley Hopkins' words, plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. These ascetics are not bivocation or practiced scholars or intellectuals. Producing new culture is peripheral and even sometimes an obstruction to their work, which their efforts are dedicated with immense reserves of patience to a cosmic temporality, right? In which the preservation of human culture is a testament to God. There's a curious absence of Christian apocalyptic thought in Miller's book. The events foretold in the Book of Revelation seem to have been displaced by the actual cataclysm of nuclear war, which is known to that future as the flame deluge. Instead, the monks seem more worried about the dangers of unleashing another such cataclysm, especially for the abbots in the second and third sections of the book, set in 3174 and 3781, respectively, through whose eyes we see a renaissance of scientific thought and a subsequent rebirth of industrial atomic civilization. And, of course, the monks' fears prove justified in the third section of the book as the Asian coalition and the Atlantic Confederacy unleash a nuclear war on each other from space. In a last-ditch effort to save human culture and Catholicism, the Church sent the memorabilia into space along with a select group of monks and priests. A Canticle for Leibowitz was inspired in part by Walter Miller's participation as a member of the bomber crew in the Allied bombing of the Abbey of Monte Cassino in the Italian campaign of World War II. And the book is imbued with the complicated Weltschmerz common to literature produced by veterans of that war. The utopianism of Miller's book, The Survival and Rebirth of Modern Technological Civilization, is on the one hand undercut by a deeply essentialist pessimism about human nature, and on the other hand contrasted against the salvific power of Christian faith. Secular thought is portrayed in the book as vain, arrogant, short-sighted, complicit with tyranny, and ultimately doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, as both tragedy and farce. What this vision of utopia might offer contemporary thought isn't immediately obvious unless we read it as an admonition to take up religious orders. But if we focus in from the big picture, in which those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, while those who do study it are doomed to immediately watch it be repeated, we might take a lesson from Miller's bookleggers. That is, we might begin to think of the work that we do as scholars, writers, intellectuals, and librarians as no longer existing primarily in relation to a capitalist liberal notion of the public sphere, but rather as functioning within a network of interconnected cells operating on a different temporality from and with different values than contemporary mainstream culture. We might accept a role that is closer to Theodor Adorno and Edward Said's idea of the intellectual as internal exile. And as such, we might worry less about leveraging our work into public fora, and more about building sustainable communities among ourselves, for ourselves, that are robust enough to survive hostile environments, both biological and political. Miller's book offers us a survivalist utopia in which church and state are separate and often opposed. And it might have something to teach us about how the academy, as an institutional idea, might survive the coming catastrophe through a commitment to extra political values and temporalities. Russell Hoban's novel Ridley Walker, by contrast, offers a church and state fused together in a world of barely literate feudalism. Ridley Walker is also set many centuries after a nuclear holocaust, but this time in Kent, England, now called Inland, among a scattering of villages and hunter-gatherer tribes ruled by the Lords of the Ram. The most notable feature of Ridley Walker is that it's written in an orally inflected, imagined dialect of future English. Hoban, another World War II veteran, called his Ridley speak a breaking down and twisting of standard English. And while readers have argued, interestingly, about how linguistically accurate Hoban's Ridley speak is, it's an impressive technical accomplishment that contributes a rich texture to Hoban's vivid and fine-grained utopia. Indeed, Ridley speak isn't merely a stylistic feature. The novel is deeply concerned with language and narrative and how these relate to politics and how culture and memory and history are embedded in language. The novel's plot follows its narrator, Ridley Walker, from his naming day when he becomes an adult to the novel's end, where he becomes an outlaw puppeteer. The work begins with a virtuosic act of world building. On my naming day when I come 12, I gone front spear and killed a wild boar. He probably been the last wild pig on the Bundle Downs. Anyhow, there hadn't been none for a long time before him, nor I ain't looking to see none again. He didn't make the ground shake nor nothing like that when he come on my spear. He weren't all that big, plus he looked poorly. He done the required, he turned and stood and clatter his teeth, and he made his rush, and there we were then. Him on one end of the spear, kicking his life out, and me on the other end, watching him die. I said, your turn now, my turn later. The other spear's gone in then, and he were dead, and the steam coming up off him on the rain, and we all yelled, offert. The whole thing felt just that little bit stupid. Us running that boar through that last little scrump of woodling and the forms all around, cows mooing, sheep's baaing, cocks crowing, and us foraging our last boar in a thin gray gurzel on the day I come a man. In 2 short paragraphs, we're introduced to Ridley, shown his position in his community, and shown his ironic detachment from that community and its rituals. We're invited to trust his distrust of the ritual because he shows us how he sees his world changing around him. The boar is small and looketh poorly, probably the last wild pig on the Bundle Downs. And the hunt took place in that last little scrump of woodland and the forms of farms all around. Agricultural development is deforesting the wilds of inland, farms and villages under the Ram's rule, crowding out Ridley's people, who still remain tenuously connected to a more autonomous hunting life, for the moment at least. Ridley, we learn, also is the son of the village's connection man, and on his father's death becomes a connection man himself, one of the few literate members in what is primarily an oral culture. The role of the connection man is to interpret the Yusa shows, which are the traveling puppet shows sent out by the regional feudal leaders, identified collectively with the island on which they live as the Ram. The Yusa shows act out aspects of the Yusa story, which is inland's myth of the fall of civilization. And it's an amalgam of the legend of St. Eustace and a kind of story about a nuclear war and other sort of legends syncretically jammed together. The Yusa shows are the centerpiece of regular tribal rituals, both religious and political in nature, and which also serve as a way of connecting the villages of inland to the Ram in a world in which the swiftest messenger is a man on foot. The Yusa shows are one of the main examples of the persistence of pre-apocalyptic language and knowledge in Ridley's world in evolved, corrupted, and adapted forms. Other examples include a mutant cult centered around the Archbishop of Cambrai, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and esoteric chemical knowledge handed down within secretive guilds of dyers and charred coal burners. So, on one level, Ridley's story is about a political struggle between members of the Ram and the Archbishop of Cambrai. occurring amidst a broader social transition from mixed nomadic hunting, foraging, and farming economy to a primarily settled agricultural one, to find and control the secrets of pre-apocalyptic technology, which turn out in the event to be nothing more than the recipe to produce crude gunpowder. Ridley's caught up in this struggle and must navigate the complicated and often bloody politics of inland while negotiating his own relationship to these living esoteric traditions of ancient knowledge. But related to this, the novel is on another level a mystical quest narrative about Ridley's initiation into another very different kind of ancient knowledge, the Punch and Judy show. The novel's turning point, where Ridley truly begins his quest, occurs when he finds a punch puppet buried in a pre-apocalyptic ruin. And the novel ends with the resurrection of the previously hidden tradition of anarchic punch and the Punch and Judy show, presenting Ridley Walker's assumption of the role of a Punch and Judy man as the emergence of an autonomous and oppositional peasant culture over and against the more didactic and ideological use of shows. In this version of utopia, knowledge persists in oral narrative form, and while all the products of Enlightenment intellectual sophistication, such as history, chemistry, and literary criticism, survive only in degraded, corrupted, and ideologically warped forms, maintained by the ruling class primarily as the ritual reinscription of its own power, genuinely creative folk wisdom persists in the comic and the non-instrumental, what we might recognize today as the realm of autonomous artistic or literary production. What this has to say to us today remains ambivalent. It's not hard to see Ridley Walker, the Connection Man, as an allegory of the contemporary cultural critic, parsing the esoteric meanings of the culture industry's ideological puppet shows. If we accept this reading, then Hoban's story seems to suggest that if we want to sustain a living tradition instead of merely overseeing the inevitable corruption of past knowledge, then we should give up subservient heteronymous interpretation in favor of subversive autonomous production. Yet reading this allegory in its historical context, published in 1980, written in the 1970s, surely in some sense an elegy for the passing of the anarchic, romantic energy unleashed in the 1960s, might vitiate its rather one-sided view of the complicated relationship between power and culture. Nevertheless, Hoban's vision of a primarily oral world, largely dependent on memorization, repetition, and attendant mnemonic technologies for information storage and retrieval, might suggest provocative directions for thinking about how to encode our work in sustainable forms that might survive the collapse of digital and even print culture. We all know, of course, that strong narrative structure makes arguments easier to remember and more convincing. It's a truism, whether or not it's true. Pushing this idea, this insight further, might we not incorporate into our work, along with narrative, ancient mnemonic devices used by poetry, such as rhyme and meter, which were deployed for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years to store essential horticultural, climatological, botanical, zoological, historical, astronomical, and ecological information. A fanciful suggestion, perhaps, but no less dubious than many of the high-concept collaborations currently taking place between artists and scientists, funded by interdisciplinary grants to dramatize Arctic sea ice melt or portray climate change on a human scale. Why not write a practical physics textbook for the late Anthropocene as a mythic narrative in rhymed hexameter? We could dedicate it to the memory of Lucretius. Which brings me, in a roundabout way, to my final example, J.G. Ballard's 1962 novel, The Drowned World, which is something of a swerve back to the problem of extinction, since while The Drowned World depicts human survival in a runaway greenhouse world, the novel's end leaves the future of that survival in question, and the novel's arc takes the notion of adaptation to its extreme in portraying the devolution of human consciousness into its pre-mammalian lizard mind. Cairns, the protagonist of the novel, starts out as a scientist on a quasi-military government mission launched from a UN base in northern Greenland to explore the ecological changes taking place in a lizard-filled swamp grown over the flooded remains of London, now at the northern edge of an inhospitably hot and ineluctably widening Venusian equatorial belt, and ends by breaking away. Karen ends by breaking away from his mission and plunging south toward the equatorial zones on an ironic odyssey, compelled and consumed by what seemed to be archaeopsychic memories of Homo sapiens' prehistoric evolutionary past. So he left the lagoon and entered the jungle again. Within a few days was completely lost, followed the lagoon southward through the increasing rain and heat, attacked by alligators and giant bats, a second Adam searching for the forgotten paradises of the reborn sun. Cairns is, of course, an Anthropocene Kurtz, who instead of journeying into the heart of darkness, beating in the chest of even the most civilized of Europeans, travels all the way into the lizard cortex, throbbing at the center of every human nervous system. And in the same way that Conrad's account of Kurtz ends with the failure of language in various ways, Ballard's account ends with Cairns scratching a message on a wall with the butt of an empty pistol, a message which he's sure no one will ever read. Not so much because no one will ever follow him, but because the pre-mammalian past into which his path leads is at the same time reaching past him into the future to consume all humankind. Or at least humankind as we know it. There remains in Ballard's book the obdurate suggestion that Cairns is plunging not into suicide, but into some kind of evolution. That his role as a second Adam isn't as the omega of a series beginning with a singular evolutionary alpha, but rather as the originator of a new primate line. The uneasy question that the drowned world leaves us with is not how global warming might change our political commitments, the distribution of wealth, human culture, or the English language, but how it might change our consciousness at a deep biological level. This is a difficult and disturbing possibility, as Ballard explores in his book, as epistemologically thorny as self-diagnosing mental illness, since by the time we would be able to be aware of such a possibility, it would have already changed us in unknowable ways. This is not so far-fetched as it might seem. Toxic chemicals and plastics in our air and water are disturbing our hormones, while increasingly abnormal weather patterns affect our mood, all of it messing with our heads in ways we might not even notice. Perhaps the best we can hope for, then, like Cairns, is to scratch out some kind of account of our adaptation or devolution as we succumb to the reptile logic of a drowning world. We descend from the digital to the historical, to the scribal, to the oral, to the reptile, facing irrevocable loss at every scale, in every imaginable utopia, finding ourselves, in the end, resembling nothing so much as Samuel Beckett's crap, watching the flow of memory flow away like the waters of the Liffey into the sea, despite every effort to fix life fast into a sequence of unchangeable signs that might stand in the place of its unanswerable disappearance. Yet as damned and comic as crap is, he achieves a tragic nobility in the rigor of his effort to document his confrontation with the meaninglessness of his painfully slow, painfully swift arc toward death. At our own late hour, as the Greenland ice sheet melts and the Arctic polar ice cap disappears and coral reefs die and beehives die, as democracies fail and wars spread and oil companies plumb methane-belching permafrost for new fields to frack in, we should recognize that all serious research, scholarship, criticism, and art today, everything that isn't merely cynical, instrumental, and disposable, is necessarily deeply utopian, whether it wants to admit that's the case or not, because it's predicated on the faith that there will be someone in the future to whom it matters. Even this talk, as cynical, instrumental, and disposable as it risks being, is committed in some sense to there being a future reader who, a century or two from now, might find something valuable in what I've had to say, even if only of purely historical value, of interest perhaps as evidence of an effort to confront and make sense of our civilizational suicide. My final question is, who, dear reader, might you be? What kind of world do you live in? What do we ancients look like to you as you look back at us from the late Anthropocene? What do we have to say to you? What were we able to save? Thanks. I guess we have some time for Q&A. I don't know.
Yes. Anyone have any questions? Comments?
Hi, son? Well, anyway, Fred Stott from the University of Buffalo. When we take a look at our lives today about learning how to cope with in a greenhouse gas constrained world. One of the great questions that I have, because I've been dealing with climate change for over 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
and is what are we going to do about the technologies that are going to be needed to produce the joule equivalent of our fossil fuel uses today? When we take a look at some other technologies and where we have advanced from their origins, and we look at a good example is the Wright brothers in 1903 fly a plane a couple hundred feet to today we've got rovers on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And in that 114-year period, we were able to accomplish a lot in the aeronautic industry. Well, where do we see the same kind of developments for replacing the carbon-produced energy that we have today? Not just saying that we have to replace what we're using today, but gearing up for what might be 10 to 12 billion people on Earth in about 100 to 150 years, maybe even more than 12 billion people. And because if we don't, we're going to lose the energy to manufacture our way out of the problem that we have created. And I think that what your comments are is reflecting on the fictional literature being perhaps pretty spot on in terms of that collapse taking place as we will run out of coal, we will run out of oil, and we will run out of natural gas in its extractable forms. And then maybe 200, 250 years, there's not going to be fossil fuels to worry about. So I was just wondering if you had any comment.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the urgency that the urgency of the problem that we're looking at with catastrophic climate change is actually on a shorter time scale than centuries. In terms of its shock that it's going to cause through global carbon-fueled capitalist civilization as it exists now. And so we won't even get to the end of oil before already everything will be in crisis. I mean that the technologies are there. That I'm not. And there are different plans, different models for making that kind of transition. Different mixes of nuclear and renewable and geothermal and in a certain through a certain lens, it's all eminently doable to shift off of a fossil fuel economy. But the problem is, there's a couple problems. One is that the political technologies that we have aren't responsive to this issue, and a second and related problem is that the people who run things now aren't that interested in making that shift, because they run things because the economy is based on fossil fuels, right? And if they were to make that shift, it would be a dramatic destabilization of their literal power base, right? And they're not going to let that happen. Yeah, I think again, from a certain lens, like that, a transition off fossil fuels is totally possible. I just don't think it's likely at all in time. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. But okay. Yeah, I don't want to go over into the. But
So that's an interesting question about the fossil fuels. But one of the other things that's happening is reskilling, that people are trying to learn old skills that can be used before or before fossil fuels were common,
mm-hmm.
and trying to revive the old stories that go along with that.
Yeah.
And there has to be cultural revival as well to incorporate those kinds of technologies. So
Yeah.
do you see any? I mean, do you see any hope in that story, or?
Hope is such a four-letter word. I do see utility in those in exactly what you're saying, in you know, relearning pre-modern or pre-fossil fuel skills and technologies. It's, you know, I think it would be misguided in a certain way to think that that's gonna save, or that it could save everybody, or that it might even save us. But I do think that's a valuable thing to do, and I think I think it will be helpful for people as we go through whatever is coming, right? To be able to, you know, farm and sow and you know how to make charcoal and what have you. Yeah.
One more question.
Yes, I thought it was quite profound the way you ended the talk with speaking to your future audience.
Mm-hmm.
But it got me to thinking about who is your current audience. You know, I mean, when you're doing your work, you're constructing your narratives. Which audience are you aiming at, and you know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I sort of started on this project or this line of thinking a couple years ago when I took a seminar. It was at the School for Criticism and Theory at Cornell, and was in a seminar on the Anthropocene. It wasn't the main direction of my research. And I hadn't really been paying attention to climate change for a long time. I'd been working on war and imperialism and the veteran as a figure in American culture. But it was in looking at climate change, I was like, holy shit, it's bad. And kind of had an existential crisis. And I'm a writer, so I sort of worked it out by writing and published a short essay in the New York Times, learning how to die in the Anthropocene, which I expected. I mean, I thought, you know, it was a fine piece of work as writing, but I expected it to sort of go out into the world, and I would get some feedback from some wackos, and then that would be it. Some climate deniers would tell me I'm wrong, and so on. But it was enormously popular. There was a tremendous response, I think in part because there's widespread cultural anxiety about what we're living through, and not very very responsible, thoughtful articulations of that. There, or at least, you know, there are, but like people wanted more, right? And it's complicated, and there's a lot more to say there. I don't want to take up too much more time, but so writing the book and following out this line since then, I feel like my audience is people who are freaked out, and part of what I'm trying to do, or part of what I was trying to offer with the book, is a kind of philosophical, to offer the book as a practical meditation on sort of not being so freaked out about what's happening. It's not the kind of book that's going to convince someone who is, you know, who's a climate change denier. I'm not going to convince them to accept that. But people who have some sense of what's happening, I think in that case I'm trying to speak to them and say, you know, not that we can deal with this, but that like this is part of our life. Like death is part of life, basically. It's sort of Buddhist in that way. And since then I've also, you know, and so then it's been an evolving conversation, right, with audiences, like coming to talk at places, and then the things people say back, and then trying to push my own thinking further on these things. So it's an evolving conversation now. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all.